There's a version of you being carved into permanence right now, and you're almost out of time to stop the carving. Think of a record player. The needle doesn't create the groove on the first pass. It barely leaves a mark. But run the same track enough times, and the groove deepens on its own, until eventually the needle isn't choosing where to go anymore. It's simply following a path that's already been cut too deep to leave. That's not a metaphor about music. That's what's happening inside your mind, right now, with every decision you've been making on repeat for years. 2027 isn't a deadline someone invented to sell you something. It's simply the next pass of the needle. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The groove doesn't ask your permission to deepen. It deepens whether you're paying attention or not, whether you meant to repeat the pattern or not, whether you still remember choosing it in the first place or not. The mind running your life right now isn't fixed yet, but it's closer to fixed than it was 5 years ago. And by the time this year ends, it will be closer still, unless something changes the track before the next pass cuts it in for good. Let's talk about why this actually happens, because once you understand the mechanism, the fear starts to make a strange kind of sense, and so does the way out of it. Your brain runs on one brutal, unsentimental rule. Whatever gets used the most, gets strengthened the most. Neural pathways that fire together, wire together, and the ones you fire most often become the path your mind reaches for automatically, without asking your permission first. Go back to that record player from a moment ago. The needle doesn't judge the track. It doesn't ask whether the song is good for you. It simply follows whatever groove has been cut the deepest, because deepest is easiest, and easiest is where the needle always lands by default. This is precisely why change gets harder with every passing year, not easier, the way people assume it should with age and wisdom. Someone who's only run a fearful thought a few hundred times can redirect it with relative ease. Someone who's run that same thought tens of thousands of times isn't dealing with a bad habit anymore. He's dealing with something closer to architecture. The belief isn't sitting on top of his mind now. It's load-bearing. He'll spent his career watching this exact pattern play out across hundreds of men, decades before anyone could explain it in terms of neurons. He described the subconscious as something that accepts whatever gets repeated into it, without discriminating between what serves a person and what destroys them. Strip away the language of his era, and what he was actually describing was a groove, one that doesn't ask whether a thought is true. It only asks whether that thought has been played often enough to become the default track. Here's the part that should genuinely frighten you, if you let it land the way it's meant to. Every year you spend telling yourself, "I'll start when things settle down," is not a neutral year. It is an active year of reinforcement for the exact belief keeping you stuck. You are not standing still while you wait for the right moment. You are cutting the groove deeper, one repetition at a time, convinced you're simply pausing. Think about a man sitting in the same job he privately resents, telling himself for the 8th consecutive year that next year is when he'll finally make a move. He isn't lazy. He isn't stupid. He is, in the most literal sense, becoming someone for whom staying is easier than leaving with every month that passes. The belief, "I'm not ready yet," isn't just an opinion he holds anymore. It has become infrastructure. Removing it doesn't feel like changing his mind. It feels like demolition. This is where the calendar becomes genuinely relevant, not as some arbitrary marketing device, but as an honest description of how compounding works. A belief reinforced for one more year doesn't get 1 year harder to remove. It gets exponentially harder, the same way a groove doesn't resist the needle the same on the first pass as it does after 10,000 plays. The mind isn't punishing you for waiting. It's simply doing what it was built to do, treating repetition as evidence of truth, regardless of whether that repetition was ever a conscious choice. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud, because it's uncomfortable enough to make people change the channel. There is a version of you, further down this same road, for whom this entire conversation will stop being relevant. Not because the truth changes, but because the groove will have deepened past the point where hearing the truth is enough to move you out of it. That version of you won't be lazy or broken. He'll simply be so identified with the pattern that a video like this one will sound like noise instead of a warning. That's not a threat. That's what happens to belief systems left unchallenged long enough. This is why the frame of before 2027 isn't about a fresh start or a symbolic date on a calendar. It's about honestly acknowledging that you are, right now, at a specific and measurable point on a curve, and the curve bends harder in one direction than the other, the longer it's left alone. The good news is that the same mechanism responsible for locking you in is the exact mechanism capable of setting you free. The groove that trapped you was carved through repetition. It can be recarved the same way. But before we get to how that recarving actually works, there's something more specific you need to understand first, because knowing that repetition builds belief isn't enough on its own. You need to know exactly what you've been repeating without realizing it. And that answer is usually far more uncomfortable than people expect it to be. Here's the uncomfortable part, so let's not soften it. You already know what you've been repeating. You've just never said it in a full sentence, out loud, and let yourself hear how it actually sounds. Most people assume the groove trapping them is made of something dramatic, a single traumatic failure, a public humiliation, a moment they can point to and say, that's when it broke. Occasionally that's true, but far more often, the groove was cut by something much quieter and far more dangerous, precisely because it never felt significant enough to notice while it was happening. A sentence repeated to yourself in the car, on the way home from a day that didn't go the way you wanted. A private thought you've had so many times you no longer register it as a thought at all. It just feels like the weather inside your own head. Think about the specific phrases that run through your mind on a hard day, the ones that arrive so automatically you never actually examine them. This is just how things are for people like me. I've never been good at this. Maybe I'm just not built for that kind of life. These sentences feel like conclusions. They are not conclusions. They are grooves, cut by nothing more sophisticated than repetition, and mistaken for self-knowledge because they've been playing so long they finally sound like your own voice instead of something you learned. This is a pattern Hill returned to often, in different language depending on the decade, but always pointing at the same target. That most people are not held back by their circumstances nearly as often as they're held back by an old, private verdict about themselves they passed down as fact years ago and never once thought to appeal. He described it in terms of self-imposed limitation, specific that it rarely arrives as a single dramatic belief. It arrives as a habit of thought, repeated in small, unremarkable moments, until the moments accumulate into something that finally starts dictating decisions. Picture a woman who has told herself, for the better part of 2 decades, some version of, "I'm not the kind of person who takes big risks." She didn't decide this in one sitting. It built the way anything builds through repetition. A canceled application here, a swallowed idea in a meeting there, each one small enough to seem inconsequential in the moment. But every time that sentence got repeated, silently, in the privacy of her own mind, the groove cut a little deeper. By the time she's 50, the sentence doesn't feel like a belief she picked up somewhere. It feels like a fact about her nature, as fixed and unchangeable as her height. Here's what makes this specific kind of groove more dangerous than an obvious trauma. A trauma announces itself. You know something happened. You can point to the day. But a belief built from thousands of tiny repetitions never announces itself as anything. It simply becomes background noise indistinguishable from your own personality, which means most people go their entire lives never once suspecting that the thing they call "just who I am" is actually the most repeated sentence they've ever said to themselves, verbatim, without ever once fact-checking it. There's a reason naming that sentence matters more than almost anything else in this process. An unnamed belief is nearly impossible to challenge, because you can't argue with something you've never actually looked directly at. But the moment you drag that sentence into the light, The moment you actually hear yourself say it in full, instead of letting it run silently in the background, something shifts. Not because the sentence disappears immediately, because for the first time, you're no longer the needle blindly following the groove. You're the one looking directly at the groove itself, which is the very first requirement for ever being able to cut a new one. So here's the honest question worth asking before we go any further. What is your sentence? Not the polished version you'd say to a friend if they asked how you're doing. The real one. The one that plays when no one else is listening, and you're the only witness to how often it repeats. Naming the sentence is the first move, but naming it alone doesn't cut a new groove. And this is exactly where most people get stuck, sometimes for years, mistaking awareness for change. Here's what almost nobody warns you about this process. Insight feels like progress. It genuinely does. The moment you finally say your sentence out loud, something in you relaxes slightly, as if the hardest part is now behind you. It isn't. Insight is the flashlight. It shows you exactly where the groove is. It does absolutely nothing on its own to fill it back in. And a lot of people spend years circling the same insight, having the same realization over and over in therapy sessions, journals, conversations with friends, mistaking the repetition of understanding for the repetition that actually rebuilds anything. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video, so let's be precise about it. Understanding a groove exists changes what you know. It does not automatically change what your mind defaults to under pressure. At 2 in the morning, in the exact moment an old fear gets triggered by something completely unrelated to the insight you had last Tuesday. The groove doesn't erase itself out of respect for your newfound self-awareness. It simply keeps being the deepest, easiest path available until something else gets cut deep enough to compete with it. Hill didn't stop at telling people to understand their limitations. He insisted, repeatedly, on autosuggestion, the deliberate, repeated, emotionally charged act of feeding the mind a new thought, on purpose, with enough consistency that the new thought eventually competes with, and finally overtakes, the old one. Not because saying something new feels good in the moment, because repetition, and only repetition, is what originally cut the old groove, and repetition is the only thing capable of cutting a new one deep enough to survive real pressure. Think about what it would actually take to change the route of a river that's carved its path over decades. You can't argue the river out of its route. You can't simply understand the river differently and expect the water to comply. The only thing that redirects a river is consistent, physical redirection, a new channel dug, again and again, until the water finally starts flowing through the new path more easily than the old one. Belief works exactly the same way. The old sentence doesn't get argued out of existence. It gets outcompete by a new sentence, repeated with enough consistency and enough genuine feeling behind it that it eventually becomes the easier path to follow. This is where a lot of well-intentioned effort quietly fails, and it's worth naming the failure honestly instead of glossing over it the way most advice does. People here repeat a new belief, and imagine reciting an affirmation once or twice in the mirror before rushing off to their actual day, then wondering, weeks later, why nothing changed. A single pass of water doesn't redirect a river. A single week of half-hearted affirmations doesn't compete with a groove that's been cut for 20 years. This isn't a flaw in the method. It's simply an honest description of the actual physics involved. The old groove had decades of repetition behind it. The new one needs sustained repetition too, not because the principle is wrong, but because you're not fighting a light switch. You're fighting geology. Here's the part that should reframe how you think about the months ahead of you, before this year runs out. If repetition is truly the mechanism, and it is, then every day you spend consciously feeding a new sentence into your mind is a day working directly against the exact deadline this video opened with. You are not just hoping for change. You are actively recarving the channel, one repetition at a time, in a race against a groove that's been deepening for years without your permission and will keep deepening whether you engage with it or not. If something in what you just heard is landing right now, if you already know, clearly, which old sentence has been running your decisions longer than it should have, I want you to do something small before we go further. Write the words "I believe" in the comments below, not as decoration, as the very first repetition of a new channel, spoken out loud instead of left silent in your own head. The people who take this small, specific step are the ones who actually begin recarving tonight, instead of simply nodding along and closing the tab. Because knowing that repetition is the mechanism raises an immediate, practical question: repetition of exactly what, said exactly how? And how do you make sure the new sentence is strong enough to actually survive contact with the old one? So let's get specific, because vague repetition is almost as useless as no repetition at all. And this is where a lot of people accidentally sabotage their own effort without realizing it. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes the first time they try this. They pick a sentence built around negation. I'm not afraid of failing. Money isn't scary to me anymore. It feels logical. It directly addresses the fear. And it quietly undermines itself every time it's repeated, for a reason most people never stop to consider. Your mind cannot process a negation without first summoning the thing being negated. Say, I'm not afraid of failing enough times, and you haven't been practicing courage. You've been rehearsing failure, with the word not doing almost none of the protective work you assumed it was doing. Go back to the river from earlier. Digging a trench that runs parallel to the old channel, close enough that the water can still slip back into it, doesn't redirect anything. It just gives the water two ways to reach the same old destination. A sentence still shaped around the fear it's supposedly replacing works the same way. Technically new wording, same old channel underneath it, still perfectly reachable. This is why the new sentence has to stand on completely separate ground, with no reference at all to the fear it's replacing. Not, I'm not afraid of taking risks, but something that exists independently. I move toward opportunity clearly and without hesitation. The new sentence should be able to survive even if the old fear had never existed in the first place. That's the test. If removing the old belief from the sentence changes what it means, the trench still runs parallel to the same river. There's a second requirement that matters just as much, and it's the one people skip because it feels harder to control on command: emotion. A sentence repeated flatly, the way you'd read a grocery list, barely registers with the part of your mind responsible for actually cutting new channel. Your subconscious doesn't respond to vocabulary. It responds to charge. Reciting a new belief while distracted, thinking about something else entirely, produces almost nothing measurable even after weeks of technically doing the work. Here's what actually works instead, and it's smaller than people expect. You don't need to manufacture a feeling you've never had. You need to locate one you already own from somewhere else in your life and aim it at the new sentence. Think of a moment where you genuinely felt steady, capable, in control of something difficult, finishing a task you almost gave up on, staying calm while someone else panicked, simply getting through a week that could have gone much worse. That feeling is real. It's sitting in you right now, regardless of whether you've ever used it for this specific purpose. Directing it at your new sentence isn't pretending. It's pointing proof you already have at ground you haven't claimed yet. Picture a woman rehearsing, I am capable of learning anything I set my mind to. Someone who left school young and has spent 30 years quietly believing that door closed permanently. Said flatly, the sentence does almost nothing. 5 words competing against decades of evidence to the contrary. But when she pairs it with the specific memory of teaching herself to manage the books for her own small business from nothing, no course, no help, just persistence until the numbers finally made sense, something shifts. The sentence stops being a hopeful guess about a stranger. It becomes a description of something that already happened once, simply pointed at a wider target now. Timing matters here too, more than people expect. This repetition works best away from pressure entirely, not in the middle of the moment that tests you, but earlier, in the ordinary stretches of an average day when nothing is testing you yet. Standing in line, walking to the mailbox, waiting for water to boil. You're not trying to out-argue the old channel in real time. You're trying to have the new one already cut deep enough, calmly, in advance, that it's simply the path available when pressure eventually arrives and asks something of you. So the real skill isn't found in the heat of the moment at all. It's found in the quiet, boring repetitions nobody sees or applauds, which is precisely why so few people ever actually finish the work, even after they've understood exactly what it requires. Here's something almost nobody prepares for, and it's the exact moment where a lot of genuine effort quietly falls apart. The old channel doesn't just sit there passively while you dig the new one. It fights back. This sounds almost too dramatic to be literal, but stay with the mechanics, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. The first few times a new sentence genuinely starts competing with an old belief, something counterintuitive happens. The old fear doesn't get quieter. It gets louder, sharper, more insistent, as if some part of your mind has just noticed, for the first time in years, that its territory is actually being contested. Think about what happens the first time you genuinely try to change course after driving the same route home for a decade. Your hands know the old turns without thinking. The first time you deliberately take a different road, something in you feels almost anxious about it. Not because the new road is dangerous, but because your mind has no worn path there yet, and unfamiliar registers, briefly, as unsafe. The old route doesn't lose its pull just because you consciously chose differently once. If anything, the pull gets more noticeable the moment you stop following it automatically. The exact same mechanism governs an old belief about money, about risk, about what you're allowed to become. It got comfortable running unopposed for years. The first real resistance doesn't get met with quiet surrender. It gets met with everything the old pattern has left. Persistence, in Hill's actual framing, was never described as a smooth, steady climb toward a goal. It was described as something closer to holding ground while it's actively being contested, expecting resistance to intensify right before it finally breaks, rather than reading intensified resistance as proof you picked the wrong direction. Picture a woman 2 months into deliberately replacing an old belief that she's just not the kind of person people take seriously. A story that's quietly shaped every meeting she's sat through for 15 years. The first few weeks feel almost manageable, carried by the novelty of doing something different. Then, further in, something shifts. The old doubt doesn't fade. It spikes, showing up around smaller moments than before, in situations that never used to trigger it at all. She starts to wonder if she's actually gotten more anxious instead of less. What she's not seeing yet is that the old channel isn't gaining strength. It's making its last serious attempt to hold water it can feel draining away. This is the exact point where most people quietly stop, misreading intensified resistance as proof of failure instead of what it actually is, the closing argument of an old pattern that senses it's losing ground. If she stops here, the old belief gets to claim this moment as evidence it was right all along. If she holds, even shakily, even without full confidence, something different happens. The old pattern runs out of new material. It's already spent everything it had. There's a specific kind of steadiness this requires that has nothing to do with feeling brave. You don't need confidence to hold new ground. You need willingness to stay uncomfortable slightly longer than the old pattern expects you to, because that's genuinely all it takes at this stage, not eliminating the discomfort, just refusing to let it make the decision for you one more time than it already has. Here's why this particular stretch matters so much given everything this video opened with. This is precisely the moment most people abandon the process, mistaking the old groove's loudest, most desperate defense for proof that nothing is actually changing. And every time someone quits here, they don't just fail to build the new channel. They add one more layer of reinforcement to the old one, deepening the exact groove this entire video has been warning you about, making the next attempt even harder than this one already was. This is also where the calendar becomes personal again, not abstract. Every year someone spends starting this process, and abandoning it right at the moment of resistance isn't a wasted year. It's an actively damaging one, cutting the old channel deeper specifically because the attempt to escape it got interpreted as further proof it couldn't be escaped. The version of you standing at this exact crossroads in 2027, having tried and quit at this same stage 3 or 4 more times, will have a groove considerably harder to recarve than the one you're standing in front of right now. So the real question isn't whether resistance will show up once you start this work. It will, reliably, almost on schedule. The real question is whether you'll recognize it correctly when it arrives, as the sound of an old pattern finally losing, not the sound of you failing. Let's talk about the actual window you're working inside, because before 2027 isn't just a phrase built for urgency. It reflects something real about how belief systems actually calcify over time, and understanding the shape of that curve changes how seriously you take the next few months. Go back to that channel your mind has been cutting for years. When a channel is young, its banks are still soft, wet clay, easy to reshape with your hands if you catch it early enough. But clay left alone doesn't stay soft. Over years, exposed to the same conditions, it hardens. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then, past a certain point, it stops responding to pressure the way it used to. What could have been reshaped with a light touch a year ago now requires something closer to demolition. This is not a metaphor stretched for effect. It's a fair description of what happens to a belief left unchallenged across years instead of months. A pattern you've held for 18 months still has soft banks, relatively speaking. The same pattern held for 18 years has had time to recruit an entire life around it. Habits built to accommodate it, relationships that quietly expect it, a version of your own identity constructed, brick by brick, on top of an assumption nobody ever went back to check. Think about what actually changes between someone who's believed, "I'm bad with money" for 3 years versus someone who's believed it for 30. The 3-year version is a bad habit with some supporting evidence attached to it. The 30-year version is no longer just a belief. It's the reason he never learned to read a balance sheet, never asked for the raise, never let himself get close to anyone who might have challenged the story directly. The belief didn't just persist. It hardened the banks around itself, recruiting decades of decisions that all quietly confirmed the original sentence, making it look, from the inside, like overwhelming proof instead of what it actually is, a self-fulfilling loop with 30 years of momentum behind it. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly, because it's the actual argument underneath this video's entire title. This isn't about 2027 being magically different from any other year. It's about being honest that the belief you're carrying right now has harder banks than it did in 2020, and it will be harder still by 2030 if nothing interrupts it between now and then. The specific date was never the point. The direction of the curve is the point, and the curve only bends one way when it's left alone. There is real, genuine good news buried inside this, though, and it deserves to be said plainly instead of glossed over. The banks aren't actually stone yet. Hardened clay can still be broken and reshaped. It simply takes more deliberate force than it would have taken earlier, more sustained repetition, more honest confrontation with exactly how deep the old channel has been allowed to run. Nothing in this video is suggesting you've missed some permanent, unrecoverable deadline. What it's suggesting is that the cost of waiting is not flat. It compounds. And the version of you reading this a year from now, having done nothing differently, will be facing a slightly more expensive version of the exact same work available to you right now, tonight, for less effort than it will ever require again. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Because there's one more piece of this you need to understand before any of what we've covered so far can actually hold. What happens the moment real change starts working, and the specific way people close to you respond to watching it happen. Here's something worth understanding clearly, because it's going to determine whether the new channel you're cutting actually survives contact with your real life, outside of quiet moments alone with your own thoughts. The people closest to you have spent years building their own plans around the predictable flow of your old pattern. Not maliciously, practically. The way a farmer plants along a river's known course, trusting the water to keep arriving exactly where it's always arrived. They've made countless small decisions. What to expect from you, what to ask of you, what role you play in the shape of their own lives, based on the reliable path you've been running for years. When that path starts shifting, it isn't just your identity being disrupted. It's their planning. This is precisely why change, even good change, even change someone claims to want for you, sometimes gets met with a resistance that feels confusing to receive. It rarely comes from malice. It comes from someone whose own arrangements were quietly built around the water going where it's always gone. Think about a marriage where one partner has spent 15 years being the anxious one about money, checking, worrying, deferring every financial decision to the other person, who became, by default, the calm and capable one. When the anxious partner finally starts doing the deliberate work this video has described, actually cutting a new channel around confidence and steady decision-making, something unexpected can happen in that marriage. The other partner, the one who built an entire identity around being the strong one in this particular area, doesn't always celebrate the shift the way you'd expect. Sometimes there's an unspoken discomfort, even a quiet resistance, because the whole arrangement, who handles what, who reassures whom, who gets to feel needed in this specific way, was built around water flowing where it always used to flow. A changed channel means everyone downstream has to recalculate their own position. There's a particular kind of resistance worth naming here, distinct from simple disapproval. It rarely means the people around you are working against you on purpose. It usually means they're responding, honestly and understandably, to a version of the water they've spent years planning their own lives around. Their surprise isn't proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof the channel is actually moving. This is also why some resistance won't announce itself as resistance at all. It'll sound like concern. Just don't want you to burn out chasing all this at once. It'll sound like a joke that lands slightly off. Look who suddenly thinks he's a numbers guy. It'll sound like a subtle pulling back from a conversation that used to be easy, because the easy version depended on you staying exactly where you were. Here's the distinction that actually matters, and it isn't between people who support you and people who don't. Almost nobody who loves you consciously wants you stuck. The distinction is between relationships that can absorb the new channel and adjust their own planning around it, and relationships that were quietly depending on the old water, never moving at all. The first kind survives this, sometimes even strengthens because of it. The second kind gets genuinely tested, and pretending otherwise doesn't protect anyone. It just delays a reckoning that was always eventually going to arrive. There's a specific kind of resolve this calls for, separate from the resolve required to build the new channel in the first place. It's the willingness to let the water keep moving even while someone you love is visibly recalculating their footing on the bank beside it, without stopping the flow to make their recalculation easier, and without treating their discomfort as proof you've made a mistake. Their adjustment period is real. It is not, however, your responsibility to prevent, and it was never a reliable signal about whether the new direction is correct. The honest question worth sitting with here isn't whether this will happen. It's how ready you are to let a few arrangements shift, quietly and without apology, in relationships built around a version of you that's already becoming outdated. There's no comfortable way to sit with that. But the water doesn't wait for comfort before it moves, and neither, eventually, can you. The stretch that comes right after resistance finally breaks isn't the finish line, even though it feels like it should be. It's simply the point where the real, quiet work becomes invisible in a completely new way. Most people assume that once resistance fades, progress should start showing up in obvious, measurable ways almost immediately. It rarely does, and this catches people off guard specifically because they've just survived something genuinely hard, and they expect the reward to match the effort. What actually happens instead is subtler, and if you don't know to look for it, it's easy to mistake for nothing happening at all. Think about how a river system actually grows stronger over time. The visible channel, the one carrying water on the surface, isn't the whole story. Underneath it, invisibly, smaller tributaries are slowly connecting to the main channel. Thin threads of water finding their way underground, joining the larger flow one narrow connection at a time, long before any of that joining shows up as a visible increase in the river above. Someone standing on the bank, watching only the surface, would see no change for a long stretch. The river looks the same today as it did last month. But underneath, connection after connection is quietly being made, and eventually, the accumulated effect of all those invisible tributaries surfaces as something undeniable, a river that's simply, suddenly, carrying more than it used to. This is what actually happens inside a mind that's been repeating a new sentence consistently through the resistance we just talked about. Each repetition doesn't show up individually as a visible before and after. It's a tributary, joining underground, invisible from the surface. A moment where you caught the old thought and consciously chose the new one instead, in a situation too small to even remember by dinner. A decision made slightly differently than you would have made it a year ago, so subtly you almost don't register the difference yourself. None of these moments look like transformation while they're happening. They look like nothing. But they're the exact thing accumulating beneath a surface that hasn't visibly shifted yet. Here's the part that trips people up at this exact stage, and it's worth naming directly because it costs a lot of people the entire process right when they're closest to the payoff. They keep checking the surface for proof. They want to see the river visibly wider today than it was last week, and when they don't, they conclude the tributaries aren't actually connecting, that all this repetition has been pointless. This conclusion feels reasonable. It's also almost always wrong. For a specific, structural reason, surface checking interrupts the very accumulation it's trying to measure, the same way constantly digging up a connection to see if it's forming underground disturbs the ground before the connection ever gets the chance to complete itself. Hill insisted that a definite purpose has to be paired with persistence sustained without visible evidence, and his own observations suggested that evidence, once it finally arrived, tended to arrive later than people expected and all at once rather than gradually. This wasn't offered as comfort. It was an accurate description of how accumulation actually works, in a mind exactly like it does in a river system. For months into this kind of work, repeating the new sentence daily, catching the old thought and redirecting it in small, unremarkable moments nobody else would ever notice. Almost nothing has visibly changed from the outside. Same job, same house, same daily routine. But something underneath has shifted in a way that hasn't surfaced yet, and won't, for a while longer. Not because the work isn't working, but because tributaries take time to connect, and connection isn't the same thing as visibility. This is precisely why abandoning the process at month 3 or 4 is such a costly mistake, and it connects directly back to the deadline this entire video is built around. The person who quits here isn't just failing to see results. They're interrupting an accumulation that was already underway, invisible but real, and forcing themselves to start the underground work over again from zero the next time they try. While the old channel, meanwhile, keeps deepening the entire time they're not actively contesting it. So the real question at this stage isn't whether you can see change yet. It's whether you're willing to keep feeding tributaries into a river you can't see getting wider, trusting the structure of how accumulation actually works, Instead of demanding proof on a timeline the process was never built to deliver. Eventually, though, the river does surface. And here's what almost nobody describes accurately about that moment. It rarely looks like the breakthrough people spent months imagining. Most people picture change arriving as a single, dramatic scene. A moment of obvious triumph, clearly marked, the kind you could point to later and say, that's when everything shifted. Real change, the kind built through months of underground accumulation, almost never announces itself that way. It arrives instead as something almost embarrassingly small, a decision made without the usual hesitation, a number said out loud without the old flinch attached to it, a Tuesday that passes without the familiar dread showing up on schedule. And because it's small, because it doesn't come with fanfare, a lot of people miss it entirely. They're still watching for the dramatic version, so the quiet one slips past unnoticed. Think about someone who's spent years bracing every time a financial decision needs to be made, checking the account 3 times before a purchase, running the same anxious calculation in their head regardless of whether the amount actually matters. One ordinary afternoon, months into this work, they make a decision the same way anyone would, quickly, calmly, without the usual internal alarm going off first. It's only afterward, sometimes hours later, that they notice what didn't happen. No bracing, no spiral, no familiar tightness in the chest. The absence is the evidence. Not a new feeling arriving, but an old one finally failing to show up on cue. This is why so many people, even after doing the actual work this video has walked through, don't fully register their own progress until they look backward instead of forward. The change was never going to announce itself in the present tense. It shows up in retrospect, when you compare how you're currently handling something to how you would have handled it a year earlier, and notice, almost by accident, that the two versions of you made genuinely different choices under genuinely similar circumstances. Hill drew a sharp line between wishing for a result and actually becoming, internally, the kind of person for whom that result is simply consistent with who they are, and the shift from one to the other, in his observation, rarely felt like a single victory to the person living through it. It felt more like waking up one day and realizing a fight you used to have with yourself constantly simply isn't happening anymore, without being able to name the exact day it stopped. Here's the part worth understanding clearly, because it changes how you should be watching for progress from this point forward. Stop looking for a single dramatic proof point. Start noticing absences instead. The argument you didn't have with yourself before making a decision. The email you sent without redrafting it 4 times out of fear. The opportunity you said yes to at normal speed, instead of needing 3 days to talk yourself into something you actually wanted. Each of these absences is data, even though absence is a strange thing to measure, precisely because your instinct is to look for something new appearing, not for something old finally failing to show up. This also explains why people sometimes feel a strange flatness right around the moment real change has actually taken hold, instead of the triumph they expected. The fight is gone. The internal noise that used to accompany every financial decision, every risk, every moment of visibility, has quieted down to something almost unremarkable. And unremarkable, after years of internal struggle, can initially feel like something's missing rather than something's finally working, simply because you've forgotten what it feels like not to be fighting yourself. There's a specific kind of attention this calls for, patient, retrospective, willing to notice what isn't happening instead of demanding proof that something dramatic is. Because by the time you're looking for a single obvious sign that the work paid off, you may have already been living inside the result for weeks without recognizing it, simply because it arrived exactly the way real change usually does. Quietly, without asking for credit. And already, by the time you notice it, fully underway. There's one more thing worth understanding before we reach the end of this. And it's the piece that ties the urgency of this video's title back to something far more personal than a calendar date. You've spent this entire video learning that channels get cut through repetition, That resistance is a sign of progress rather than failure. That change accumulates invisibly before it ever surfaces. All of that is true, but there's a question sitting underneath all of it that we haven't asked directly yet. Why does any of this actually matter to you exactly? Not in the abstract. Not as a nice idea about self-improvement. What is the actual channel you're trying to cut? And what does the water finally reaching its destination look like in your real life, not someone else's? Here's why this question can't be skipped. Everything this video has described, the repetition, the resistance, the underground accumulation, works as a mechanism regardless of what you pointed at. But a mechanism with no named target tends to run out of fuel exactly at the point where resistance gets loudest, because vague motivation was never strong enough to survive real pressure in the first place. Hill treated a definite purpose as more than a nice phrase to open a chapter with. He treated it as the actual fuel source. Without it, the whole process this video described has nothing concrete enough to keep repeating toward once the early enthusiasm wears off. Think about the difference between someone repeating, "I am capable of financial confidence," as a general idea, and someone repeating it while picturing something exact, the number in the account that would let them stop checking it obsessively, the conversation with the one person they've been avoiding for years, the version of themselves 5 years from now who wakes up without the low-grade dread that's been sitting underneath every ordinary morning for as long as they can remember. The general version runs out of energy the first time resistance shows up. The named version has something to keep returning to when the old channel fights back, exactly the way this video described it doing. This is the actual reason the date in this video's title matters, and it's worth saying plainly instead of leaving it as background urgency. Not because 2027 holds some cosmic significance, because a real deadline forces an honest answer to a question most people leave permanently vague. What, exactly, are you building toward, and are you willing to name it clearly enough that it can actually organize the repetition this entire process depends on? Vague wanting protects you from ever having to try hard enough to fail. It also protects you from ever succeeding at anything you could point to and call real. Here's what's genuinely true about where you're standing right now. Some of what you've heard tonight has probably already started something. Not the full transformation, not yet, but the first few tributaries beginning their slow, invisible work toward a channel you haven't finished naming. That work doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require the perfect sentence or a finalized number or complete confidence that any of this will work the way it's been described. It only requires you to start feeding something real into the mechanism, instead of leaving it running on old, borrowed material you never chose. So before the final piece of this video, here's the honest question worth sitting with, the same way you sat with your own sentence earlier tonight. If the channel actually changes course, if the water really does start flowing somewhere new, starting tonight instead of starting again next year, what is waiting on the other side of that change? Not a feeling, not a vague sense of things being better, the actual, named thing. Because everything this video has described only works in service of something real, and naming that thing clearly is the last piece standing between understanding this mechanism and actually setting it in motion. Let's go back to where this started. A needle, following a groove worn deep enough that it no longer felt like a choice. A river, running the only course it had ever been given permission to run. You know now that neither of those was ever a life sentence. The groove was cut by repetition, which means it can be recut by repetition. The river was shaped by years of unquestioned flow, which means it can be redirected by the same patient force that shaped it in the first place. None of this required you to become someone fundamentally different. It only required you to notice which hands had been holding the pen and pick it up yourself. You named the sentence tonight. The real one. The one that's been running quietly beneath every hesitation, every swallowed idea, every year that slipped by under the cover of next year. You understood why insight alone was never enough, why the actual work happens in boring, unremarkable minutes nobody applauds. You learn to expect the old channel to fight back precisely when the new one starts working, instead of mistaking that resistance for proof you chose wrong. You understood that some people close to you built their own plans around water that's about to move, and that their discomfort, however real, was never yours to prevent. And you learned that change won't arrive with fireworks. It arrives as an absence, an old fear that simply doesn't show up one ordinary day, gone before you even think to look for it. Here's what's actually true, right now, at this exact moment. You are no longer only the needle. You've spent this entire video becoming the hand that gets to choose where the needle goes next, and that shift, small as it feels tonight, is the whole transformation this video promised you at the very beginning. 2027 was never the real deadline. It was simply a way of making a quiet truth impossible to ignore, that the version of you listening right now is closer to permanent than he was 5 years ago, and further from permanent than he'll ever be again. That's not a countdown meant to frighten you. It's an honest measurement of a window that's still open tonight, wider than it will be the next time you consider walking through it. You don't need the whole channel recarved by morning. You need one sentence, chosen on purpose, repeated with real feeling, starting before this feeling fades the way good intentions usually do. Everything in this video was simply explaining why that one small act is enough. You already know your sentence. You've known it the whole time. The only question left is whether tonight is the night it stops being something you carry and starts being something you replace, one repetition at a time, for as long as it takes the new water to find its own way through. Follow the channel if you're ready to find out. And share this with 5 people still running a groove they never chose, while there's still time to cut a new one.